Alright, so I know that it said something about cultural appropriation on my slide, but that's kind of wrong. I'll be talking about something else. Hopefully, like by the end of this, you'll understand to not necessarily trust signs immediately. So today I'm discussing Ulysses by James Joyce. It's probably my favorite book. I read it for the first time this past winter break, and like most normal people, when I find something that I really love, I decided to read a lot of criticism about it. And one of the most interesting pieces of criticism that I read was by this guy, Declan Keyburn. And Keyburn argued that Ulysses was James Joyce's attempt to affirm the dignity of everyday life. And this really got me to think, if James Joyce and Ulysses could in fact do these things, then what does that mean for the rest of art? So today, through the lens of Ulysses, I'd like to discuss the way in which communicative events and art sort of influence the way we both perceive ourselves and the world around us. So a little bit of context, a little bit of plot. Ulysses was written by James Joyce in 1922. Essentially, it takes place over the course of a single day, June 16th, 1904. The protagonist is outwardly pretty unremarkable. He's a middle-aged ad canvasser with a wife and a daughter, and the daughter like goes to boarding school and stuff. So he's like a pretty typical bourgeois man. Like you think, okay, but what James Joyce has done, and this is where Keyburn's argument comes into play, is that James Joyce has taken the entirety of Homer's Odyssey and placed it onto this single day. So throughout the day, this guy, Leopold Bloom, seemingly ordinary, becomes heroic as he actually eats some lotus and fights a cyclops and all these other things over the course of 24 hours. And it's important to understand why James Joyce is sort of heroicizing the bourgeoisie. That's actually drawn by James Joyce. It's not very good. I think he should have stayed. I think he was right when he decided to choose literature. But the point of the bourgeoisie is that, so coming out of World War I, as well as the Industrial Revolution, there was a burgeoning middle class. And essentially, there was quite a bit of antipathy between the upper classes as well as the bohemian, pitted against the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Here we have some of those depictions. These are actually from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So you can see that they've been around for a while. It's just been a general progression. If you start in the bottom left-hand corner, this is from William Hogarth. It's called A Rake's Progress. And essentially, so this guy, he gets some money from his father, he inherits money, but he's a bourgeois man, so he has no idea what to do with it, and it's just like a complete disaster. I think he starts out, it goes divorced, crazy orgy, loses all his money, and then he dies in a mental hospital. So James Joyce obviously thought this might have been a little bit wrong. If you go up to the top, this is from the 19th century, and it's by the French School of Art, and it's called Caricatures of the Bourgeoisie. And as you can see, they're sort of greedy, fat, buffoonish. They're wearing really garish clothing. If you want to be charmed by Flaubert, he says, seeing small-town bourgeoisie made me want to vomit and cry at the same time. And then, this is actually the most interesting one, I think. It's by 3 Russian artists. It's from the 20th century, I want to say 1989 or 1990, and it's called America's Most Wanted. And they interviewed middle-class Americans, and they said, what do you think is the best part of artwork? And based on this survey, they got the answers back, and with their tongues in their cheeks, they tried to make something that was pretty atrocious. There's George Washington in the center, backed by this big blue sky. There's a touch of nature. And the whole point of all these pieces of artwork is to create a negative association of ideas surrounding the common man. And James Joyce thought this was wrong. James Joyce, having grown up as one of 10 siblings in a rather destitute home, because I guess Father Joyce wasn't the most consistent or present father that ever existed, but he really understood that there was a value and certain dignity to the way in which people live their lives, regardless of their class, regardless of their economic position. So what James Joyce did is that he understood there was a use value in art. The same way in which Flaubert was using his artwork and the other artists were using their pieces in order to discredit and devalue the common man, James Joyce could subvert this almost like a Trojan horse, if you will. If you want to go back to Homer, yeah, some laughs, okay. So anyway, the entire point of when you talk about art and the use value of art is that art can't simply be limited to paintings of horses or anything. You'll find that art is essentially anything outside of the objective fields of math and science. Because when we communicate and we express certain events, ideas, concepts, we're doing it from our own human point of view, our own rational perspective. So essentially what James Joyce did is he changed the sign of the heroic, changing the sign of the common man. By making Leopold Bloom the typical bourgeois into the hero, into Odysseus, then he can change the sign and the association of ideas. So what are signs? Signs relate to semiotics, which is an idea developed by Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss philosopher from the 19th century. And he's actually, all these concepts relate back to Aristotle, so this has been around for a while. And the idea is that human beings, as rational, sentient beings, we must, in order to understand concepts and figures and objects, we assign meaning unto them. So if you see in the figure in the left-hand corner, or I guess this is your right, so this is what we call a tree, but the real object in its existence is simply an organism, and we give the meaning true to it. We give the real a sign. This becomes problematic, and I'll have a case study with a cat, because obviously that's the most appropriate choice for James Joyce. So the cat has two signifiers, two signs. It has Yojo and cat are both signifiers of the real. And the real is represented in this corner, and its signs, Yojo as well as cat, are in the right-hand corner, or left-hand corner, depending on where you're sitting. And then you link the two together so you understand this real object to be Yojo, to be a cat. And that's the conceptualization at the top through a neural signifier. This is problematic because you enter text, which is just a written sign of a sign. So because we're literate and we speak English in here, we have C-A-T-Y-O-J-O, which we can recognize to be cat and Yojo. But cat and Yojo is simply a sign of the sign cat and Yojo, which then relates back to the real object. So what you find with linguistics is that there's a definite separation between the real and the sign of the real. This gets even more complicated when you get quoting and naming into something. So when anybody's speaking, they're simply emitting sounds, but as like sentient beings, we can understand what you're like saying. So if I say cat, you know what a cat is because it's linked together through a neural signifier. You have the real and then the sign of the real. So let's get really complicated. If I was holding up a piece of paper and I told somebody, read this aloud, what they'd be doing is they'd be taking a sign, producing a new sign verbally, and then that would, for anybody else to understand what they're saying, that connects through a neural signifier, which then connects back to the real object. So essentially what you have is this just gigantic group of signs on signs on signs that you eventually come back to what's originally here from there. Now, why is this problematic? It's problematic because you find that meaning is really transient, it's fluid. Take the snake, for example. If you look up snake in the Oxford English Dictionary to this day, it'll have a definition that reads treacherous and evil. And you've got to ask yourself, is the snake like inherently in its nature, is this thing treacherous or evil? And it's really not. And you can trace it back to a large-scale communicative event which touches all of us because we live in a Western, predominantly Christian ideology where we understand the snake to be in its biblical context with Adam and Eve, where it was given the sign of Satan, given the sign of evil, given the sign of treachery. And even though the snake doesn't have anything inherently like bad about it, we still consider it as such because of a communicative event that occurred like 2 millennia ago. So what we realize is that when we're interpreting language, when we're considering things, we're just in a massive coded system that builds upon people from the beginning of language, depending on which language you're in. So this all relates back to James Joyce because when you see something like Flaubert's depictions, as well as America's Most Valued, that's not based in reality. We can't simply have a negative association of ideas surrounding the common man. Through artwork, we can remind ourselves or change the meaning surrounding how we consider everyday life and what we would typically push aside and consider unvalued. So essentially, James Joyce, all language, because meaning's not fixed, because you get away from the real, you can change the way people consider things, and this relates to all, essentially, racism, sexism, prejudice. It's all through communicative events, but if you can change the association of ideas surrounding something, then you will have progress. Thank you.